Okay, so I'm an immigrant. I came to this country, the UK, in 1996. Immigration was not easy for me. It took me 4 years to get my permanent residency, and I didn't get my full citizenship, although I could have had it sooner than this. I didn't actually end up getting it until about 2012. So it was a long process for me, and I have that firsthand experience to reflect on when the issue of immigration comes up, as it often does, particularly with regard to the US elections this year and, of course, Brexit. While immigration wasn't a motivating factor for me with regard to Brexit, I acknowledge that it was for a lot of people. The problem is that conservatives and liberals can't really talk about immigration. It's been such a common topic of conversation in the midterm elections, but conservatives and liberals are talking at cross purposes. They're living in two completely different realities. On the conservative side, you've got the argument that immigration represents an invasion, and that if you do not want to shut down the borders and stop immigration, then you must be in favor of open borders and just letting anyone in. Whereas on the liberal side, you're just not allowed to talk about it. The minute somebody brings up immigration reform, they get fingers pointed at them and are called a racist as soon as the subject comes up. So there's no constructive dialogue going on about this issue between right and left. I certainly haven't encountered any myself. Perhaps you have. I'd love to hear about it. But I just wanted to perhaps throw a few facts out there that you might find surprising. Now, in America in particular, we're known as a nation of immigrants, and that's not just clever branding, it's the truth. In the United States, we've got about 44 million immigrants, first-generation immigrants. Now, that makes up about 13.5% of the total population of the country. It's a big chunk, and it's very unusual. You don't find that anywhere else in the world. Number two, behind America on the proportion of, or the number of immigrants living in their country, is Germany, with about a quarter of what the U.S. has. They've got about 12 million immigrants living there. So for America, it's a unique issue in the sense that it comprises a much larger proportion of the overall population than it does in other countries. And that presents different challenges as well. How do you decide who to let in? We've got this history and this tradition of letting a lot of people into the country. What's the mechanism? How do you decide who you let in and who you don't? It is part of our tradition. If you look at the period of the U.S. history from the end of this, from 1860 through to 1920, you'll find that the average proportion of the country that was made up of immigrants was between 13 and 15%. So the fact that we're at 13.5% means that we're right smack in the range of where it has been for a long time. There was a period after the Great Depression and the Second World War where it fell right down. I think in about 1970, it reached a low of 5% of the total population. And around about that time, actually a few years earlier, Congress had passed some laws and changed some of that mechanism to make it easier to immigrate to the U.S. They wanted to encourage people to come here. And they did, and those numbers started to climb. And now we're, and have been for several decades, where we were historically on immigration. This is not a period of invasion. We are not seeing record unprecedented numbers of people coming across the border. If anything, the overall trend, looking at it long term, is on a decline. But that's not what we're hearing in politics right now. How to set that mechanism is really the heart of the immigration debate, or at least it should be. For example, you've got people coming to the States as prospective refugees. You've got people coming to the States applying for asylum status. And you've got people coming to the United States simply because they want to live there and they're just immigrating for economic reasons. Now, the breakup of that large group of people coming to the U.S. every year, which is about 1 million people a year, may not be what you expect. What country would you expect would be the one sending the most people to the U.S. each year? 175,000 people a year come from this country to the U.S., or they did in 2016. And that country is India. It's the largest largest national group of immigrants. Number 2 on the list, still not Mexico. It's China and Hong Kong, with about, I think it was 160,000 in 2016. And then number 3 is Mexico with 150. Now, Mexico for a while was much larger than that proportionally. And if you look at the total number of immigrants, that 44 million people, what was the proportion that were Mexicans? It was about a quarter of them, of the total immigrant population of the U.S. are of Mexican origin. So that's, I think, why a lot of people assume when they talk about immigration, they immediately think of Mexico and people coming from Mexico. But that's you're a bit behind the times if that's the way you're thinking, because that's not the reality anymore. It is mostly India and China which are sending people to the U.S. I say sending people. These people are coming of their own free will. Most of them are not claiming asylum or refugee status. Oh, and by the way, what's the difference between the two? Refugee status is when your nation has been identified on an international level. I think it's the UN that does it, as granting you refugee status. So there's some sort of crisis going on in a country. It's recognized on an international stage, and then anybody who immigrates to your country from that country is automatically refugee status. Now, that doesn't mean that they automatically are allowed in. In fact, it depends greatly on where their case is heard. And the same goes with asylum. Now, with asylum, people are claiming that there is some reason why they are in danger in their native country, and they are seeking safety and safe harbor, by coming to the U.S. And again, just because you're claiming asylum doesn't mean you're going to be successful. And again, it really varies wildly depending on where you seek that status. In New York City, I think they said that people claiming refugee status were accepted 75% of the time, but I believe it was Atlanta, in the Atlanta federal courts, the rate goes down to 10% successful. So 9 out of 10 people making that claim in the Atlanta court fail. And again, that immigration debate is about that mechanism. Where do you set that mechanism? How does it work? Who gets in? I have never personally heard any liberal or progressive person saying, throw open the borders, let everybody in, and we'll just see what happens. The idea that that is the Democratic policy position, or that that's what Democrats want to happen, is absurd. It's preposterous. Of course we don't. We're talking about that mechanism and whether it's fair or not. Historically, the U.S. has made some mistakes. We have failed to recognize humanitarian crises when they arose. So suddenly we're getting people coming from those crises saying, please help, we're in danger. And the U.S., failing to recognize that crisis, has sent them away. That's happened many times over our history. It happened to German Jews in the time of the Second World War. It happened with Haitians during the Duvalier dictatorship there. We just sent them back and they died. Same thing with Salvadorans in the 80s during the sort of political violence that was occurring down there. People were coming here trying to escape violence. We didn't realize it was a major issue going on there. We sent them back and they got killed. So from a progressive or liberal point of view, what you're wanting is to make sure that when something happens, it's a humanitarian crisis. For example, the situation in Honduras right now, that the U.S. is aware of it, informed about it, and compassionate towards it, so that we can react with compassion towards people who are fleeing those crises. And labeling those people as an invasion, suggesting that they are diseased, that they're violent gang members, I saw something today, some Republican congressman was claiming that they were a bunch of pedophiles in this caravan. It's the opposite of compassion. So my plea to people is we need to be able to have these debates in society. Whether it's the U.S. or the U.K., we need to be able to talk to each other about these issues without coming from two completely different planets and dealing with two completely different sets of reality. It's fine to want to secure your borders and to make sure that you have robust immigration controls. But it's also fine to want to be compassionate and to make sure that those rules are implemented in a way which has a heart and has some compassion, because the United States has a long tradition of being a compassionate democracy. Thank you for listening.